This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Delighted to introduce Dr. Clare Tebbutt, who will be speaking this evening. After the seminar, so about 45 minutes for the paper, then we'll have plenty of time for questions. And then after that, we're going back to the IHR common room, which is downstairs, for a wide reception. So please come along and join us if you're free. Clare is a postdoctoral research assistant at Nottingham Trent University and also a teaching fellow at the University of Nottingham. And at Nottingham Trent, she works with the archive of broadcast and campaigner of Great Gossip. Clare finished her PhD at the University of Manchester in 2015, where she was supervised by Laura Doan and Frank Mort. Her thesis was entitled Popular and Medical Understandings of Sex Changeability in 1930s Britain, and her research interests lie in cultural histories of the body, of sex and gender, feminism, and in social change. And her paper tonight is called Medical Appeals to Sexuality in Understanding and Policing Those Who Wanted to Change Sex during the 1930s and the 1940s.
Okay, thanks, Craig. The paper, the 1940s are going to get a very, very small look in, so it's much more 1930s as a slight proviso. So, as Craig just said, my doctoral research argued for the importance for queer history to consider sex and gender as much as sexuality. And I examined press accounts of sex change in 1930s Britain and the medical research behind many of these reports. So, to give you a bit of a sense of these newspaper reports, and this is only a very slight sense because there's a whole wealth of them. Alice Nora has written about them and sort of talked about how they appear in the Sunday press, but you can see that they're appearing across the Sunday press, across the daily papers, across the local papers. This example from 1930 is one that's been picked up in the local Wiltshire News. These are stories that, partly through the press agencies, are appearing often very similar copy across different papers, but they're also being picked up in the Australian press, in the sort of US press. So a bit of a sense of kind of some of these articles that I'm talking about. We have here a Wiltshire man-woman story about Evan Blurg from 1930. Here from 1932, a girl of 14 turned into a youth, bass voice and growing a beard. Again, sort of picking up on sort of ideas of sort of sex features of the body. This is for somebody who's unnamed, which is slightly unusual in these stories. So, 1933, we have Lily Elba in the press. She had been in the press in 1931. She reappears in the papers in 1933 with the publication of the sort of biography about her. She was the subject of what I thought was a terrible film, The Danish Girl, recently. So you have this sort of press interest in Lily Elba. She is one of the few sort of women, trans-feminine women who are discussed in these stories. It's predominantly stories of guys who have been raised female. So Lily Elba appears in the press 31 and then again 33. Here from 33 again, one of the slightly less usual stories in that there's not really a kind of sex resolution. Mark Woods / Madeline Woods, there's not really a kind of firm sense of how Woods is actually going to live their life, or kind of what sex they're actually going to sort of feel, in which they're going to feel more comfortable. This is from the Australian press. It's a Scottish case that seems to have been relatively little reported in Britain, but Mac Hutchison, again, a guy who had been assigned female at birth, from the Chicago Daily Tribune, but copyright of the New York Times, already kind of moving between different papers. This is the story of Zdenek Kubek, who had found fame as a kind of leading woman athlete, and he sort of seeks surgery in the States. He goes from what's Czechoslovakia to the States. and gets quite a lot of attention. Here, one of the most publicised British cases is Mark Weston, whom you can see here, with his fiancée. Mark, again, had been successful as a woman athlete, so-called woman athlete, which leads to articles such as this one. And this all kind of coalesces around the summer of 36, because you have the Berlin Olympics, you have this moment of kind of this big official sports event where there is a need to demarcate sex, to classify people as male or female in order to compete. So you get this big panic in the press around the idea of kind of these suspect women athletes, and how can you tell whether somebody is a woman or not. Then another story, Bosilko Stoyanov, who is a Bulgarian who had been reported to now be a man, but there's some doubt. The People seem, as a newspaper, seems very keen on kind of casting doubt on some of these stories. They're the source of most of the stories where there is some sort of sense of uncertainty as to the outcome. Here we have another sportswoman changes sex, fourth in recent months, from 1937, which is about Willem Maurits de Brem, the Belgian Flemish cyclist who had competed as Elvira de Brem. This is from the Dundee Evening Telegraph and Post. Donald Purcell, whom you can see here, and by this point in 38, the newspapers are having to find some sort of angle almost to make this newsworthy. So, you know, it's not just, here is Donald, he was formerly known as Doris, but here is Donald, oh, maybe this will be his, new wife. He is one of 24. This has, been happening. And from 1939, we have Mark and David Farrow holding up a picture of Neville Chamberlain. It's a very curious image that somehow kind of presages world events whilst being a kind of human interest story. But again, this idea that it's newsworthy not because there's been a kind of sex reclassification so much as that it's siblings. And they have a picture of Neville Chamberlain. So that's a kind of whirlwind tour through just to kind of get a sense of what these sort of stories are, their frequency, how they're appearing across the press. And so, as you can see, there were scores of articles across the local daily and weekly papers and further afield. And the idea that somatic sex was mutable and that a strict differentiation between male and female was very difficult to make was widely expressed during the decade. These changes of sex were framed as marvels of modernity, examples of the wonders of modern science. That science could change, that sex could change, rather, was given credence, and the people concerned were, for the most part, positively portrayed, and that's one of the really quite striking things about these stories. The popular press, with its massive reach, placed sex change in the public sphere and made it part of the backdrop to 1930s British life. As the decade progressed, the idea of a change in sex was treated as increasingly quotidian, a phenomenon with which readers would be familiar. As this is a series on the history of sexuality, today I'm shifting my focus from questions of sex and gender to ask how sexuality figures in these discussions of sexual variation. And I think it's useful at this point to have a note on terminology. So the phrases used by journalists in the 1930s were predominantly sex change, change of sex, and man-woman, which is a phrase that comes up quite a lot. I'm not going to talk about today, but I think is very interesting. So today, sex change is a problematic term associated with transgender people and which seems to put primacy on surgery as the validation of a trans identity. Sex change, as used in the 1930s press, referred mostly to people who might be now seen as intersex and whose sex as assigned at birth was later reclassified, hence the change in sex. And this is mostly men who'd been raised as girls. Man-woman, a term that I think appears quite a bit, if I can find, I think I've cut out a lot of them a Wiltshire man-woman. Man-woman is a term that appears quite a lot, particularly in the earlier 30s, and it encompasses a broad range of identity positions, which we might now call intersex, transgender, trans man, trans woman, genderqueer, butch, etc. So these are the terms being used by the press, particularly sort of change of sex, sex change, man-woman, whereas medics, on the other hand, had a different register to describe many of the same people. So the press's man-woman who changed sex was rendered in medical accounts as someone with an intersex medical condition, such as the adrenogenital syndrome or hypospadias, who had their sex corrected and sometimes underwent surgery. And so what is my concern with sex? And by sex, I'm sort of meaning the body, the ways in which the body is understood to be sexed. I understand queer history to be both an examination of sexual and gender variance and a troubling of our very categories of sex, gender and sexuality. And following Anne Fausto-Sterling in Sex and the Body, I take biological sex to be a category as open to interpretation as gender and sexuality have been. I wanted in my PhD to produce a queer history that focused more on sex than on sexuality, to consider how sexual ambiguity might be understood beyond the framework of homosexuality. So, for example, stories such as this have been read as part of a kind of lesbian history, and what I wanted to say was, why need that be the case? Why not take this as being something that can be understood more through sex and gender? So I wanted to understand sexual ambiguity, not for its relation to sexual identities, but for what it could reveal about understandings of the body. And I think this is an important project for queer history, and one that chimes with the growth of trans and intersex scholarship, but which is attentive to what Laura Down calls unnaming and unknowability, this idea that we can't necessarily kind of assign particular terms or sort of categories to what we're seeing in the past. However, while stressing the significance of sex as a category for investigation, sexuality remains a presence in the cases and discussions I'm looking at. The press implied sexuality through references to marriage, and medics were keen to assess patient sexuality. So what was the relationship between sex and sexuality in these medical and popular accounts? And first, I'll look at the place of sexuality in medical case studies, and then at how sexuality figured in the newspaper articles. So if I scroll back through these images, one particular surgeon was named in the press stories, and you get stories such as this one here: surgeon prevents 6 women becoming men, key to mystery of sex found, ? And doctor changes sex at 24, patients have married. You get these stories that mention by name Lennox Foster, who was an endocrinologist and surgeon who had a private practice on Harley Street and who also worked at Charing Cross Hospital in London. So Foster established a team of medics and scientists at Charing Cross who were all concerned with different aspects of what they called the adrenogenital syndrome, which is an intersex condition now known as congenital adrenal hyperplasia, and whose key symptom was virilization in women, especially the growth of facial hair. So a lot of women are turning to Foster because they're finding that they have what's sort of considered to be more male pattern sort of facial hair. And this specialised hub at Charing Cross also attracted other patients whose sex was under question in some way. So in 1938, Foster, the surgeon, edited a book called The Adrenal Cortex and Intersexuality, a book that dealt with over 100 case studies with analysis from clinical and surgical, psychological, pathological, and biochemical perspectives. You can see the kind of list of different authors, and this reflects the fact that it's taking it from these different perspectives. And very little has been written about the adrenal cortex and intersexuality, yet a large number of case studies and the variety of disciplinary approaches make the text an invaluable resource, I think, for examining ideas about sex and sexuality at this time, especially in Foster's section on the clinical and surgical aspects, and in Clifford Allen's section on the psychological ones. We see what factors were being called upon when deciding what constituted someone's sex, male, female, or otherwise. So you actually see in these case studies what is being sort of used as criterion for making these decisions. And one of the interesting features of the adrenal cortex and intersexuality is that the condition upon which it focuses, then called the adrenogenital syndrome, is governed not by the so-called sex glands, the gonads, but by the adrenals, the glands located in the seemingly sexually innocuous kidneys. So you have this idea of locating sex in the body beyond the gonads, beyond the genitals. You start to see that there is sort of the situatedness of sex and sex difference is, in this case, in the kidneys as well. The burgeoning discussion of locatedness of sex in the body could not be divorced from considerations of mind and desires. The glands are a massive source of interest through the 1930s. They appear in such popular books as Glands of Destiny, a personal favourite, which goes through 3 editions, I think, by the sort of early 40s. And it's typical in ascribing personality traits to the action of the various glands. And the very language of sex blurred distinctions we might draw between somatic sex and sexual identity. So bisexuality, for example, is a term frequently employed in medical writing, but it almost always means the presence of both male and female features in an organism, rather than kind of sexual object choice of male and female. So definite distinctions between sexuality and sex could not easily be drawn, and this kind of blurring of different ideas around sex and sexuality. Histories of intersex have tackled the question of how a person's sexuality played into diagnoses of their sex. So one of the first major studies of intersex protocols, Alice Drager's Hermaphrodites and the Medical Invention of Sex, detailed the anxieties around homosexuality expressed by British and French medical professionals dealing with uncertain sex. Similarly, Elizabeth Rice's History of Intersex in North America, Bodies in Doubt, also stressed the importance to medics of preventing homosexuality when deciding to which sex someone rightly belonged. Gertje Mack, in her History of Intersex in Western Europe, Doubting Sex, Inscriptions, Bodies and Cells in 19th century hermaphrodite case histories, went beyond Drager and Rice to argue that the subject's sense of self became a key diagnostic tool from the beginning of the 20th century, and that this notion of self could incorporate sexual object choice. So how do these histories that haven't looked at the adrenal cortex and intersexuality, what is then going on with ideas of kind of sexuality and homosexuality in relation to these case studies in the Foster and Allen book? So in the psychological chapter of the adrenal cortex and intersexuality, subtitled Adrenal Dysfunction and its Relation to Sexuality, the psychologist and psychiatrist Clifford Allen reported the results to questionnaires given to people who came to Charing Cross Hospital with questions about their sex. And Allen's interest was to determine these people's sexuality. As he remarked in the introduction to his chapter, the path to the study of relation of body to mind is one which has been obstructed by the obstinacy of the prejudiced and obscured by the conjectures of those who are reluctant to leave the comfort of their armchairs to undertake the labours of research, whereas presumably Allen is quite willing to sort of wade in. The growth of endocrinology, so hormone research, and psychopathology has emphasised the necessity, even urgency, of some investigation into the factors which control sexuality. There is no doubt that this relation of psychical and physical is one crying aloud for investigation. And in Allen's configuration of the interconnectedness of body and mind, sex and sexuality become analogous with the body, sex, and mind, sexuality. So Allen's questionnaire was designed to establish the sexuality of the patient and to map this onto their somatic sex. And this preoccupation with surveying sex linked to developing ideas of the normal and of statistical and quantifiable personality markers that the trained researcher could identify and interpret. Alan writes he's quite jealous because he's sort of been picked to the post slightly. The adrenal cortex and Sexuality appears in 1938. In 1936, Lewis M. Terman and Catherine Cox-Miles publish Sex and Personality, Studies in Masculinity and Femininity, which is a massive tome of a book that purports to be able to base, through an elaborate series of questionnaires, exactly the degree of each subject's masculinity or femininity. There's some sort of free association things that people can kind of, that the subjects are carrying out to figure this out. There's some sort of Rorschach test type things. And there was a series of questionnaires and questions that go into massive detail. And Terman, one of the authors, had already made a name for himself, I think quite interestingly, in his work on IQ tests. So you see this kind of move towards establishing the normal, towards quantifying particular traits, and all of it within a very subjective sort of social framework. So Alan's questions, designed to ascertain sexuality, were predicated on gender stereotypes, some of which were already anachronistic by the late 1930s. So, for example, type of personality, one of the questions, whether feminine or masculine in behaviour, was gauged by the patient's hobbies. So sports, an interest in sports, denoted masculinity. Reading demanded follow-up questions as to whether the patient identified with the hero or the heroine. There's sort of questions about dancing and with whom you danced. And it's quite, dancing seems to be a bit of a stumbling block for me. You can't always quite tell what the significance is. There are a lot of questions about what type of fabric you like to wear. And anybody wanting to wear soft fabric is immediately, any guy wanting to wear soft fabric is pretty much written off by Alan straight away. But this interest in sport had experienced a massive boom in 1930s Britain. It's massively popular with women. It's being sort of organised on a vast scale, and yet still Alan is seeing it as a mark of masculinity. It's not corresponding with the kind of social reality. Similarly, there are questions about smoking and women smoking that seem to kind of denote masculinity. Whereas if you look at any of these newspaper articles, you're almost bound to see a kind of, adverts aimed at women with cigarettes, women smoking. If you look at some Penny Tinkler's work, you can see that there's been this massive upsurge in kind of women smoking, and that's something quite glamorous and popular. And yet it's being used in this way as something that sort of is supposedly gendered and marks masculinity. So a woman's passion for sport could be extrapolated, according to Alan, to indicate homosexuality. And at this time, before John Money, amongst others, had cemented the idea of gender, gendered behaviours were being aligned with sexual object choice. So you see these gendered kind of notions of interested in sport, reading associates with hero, not heroine, becoming a kind of sign mark of sexuality, according to Clifford Allen. So how did these psychological assessments of sexuality fit with the clinical assessments of sex? And Allen found, similarly to Kraft-Ebing and Ellis had done before him, that one frequently finds that the strongest homosexuals are the most perfect physical specimens and have well-developed masculine bodies with no trace of glandular disease. Allen did conclude, however, that those who experience glandular problems might not develop in a normal, which is to say heterosexual manner, and this could often be righted with hormone treatment and or surgery. So for example, ES, case 15, who's 20 years old, she was never very heterosexual. Whilst at school, she had 2 boyfriends, but preferred her girlfriends to them, and tended to notice girls rather more than boys in the street, in brackets. This is very common with homosexuals. but never had any frankly homosexual dreams. She was fond of sports and played netball and enjoyed swimming. She was not very interested in clothes or cosmetics and wore her hair short. She started to become her suit at the age of 16 and an adrenalectomy was performed when she was 19. Since her operation, she's noticed a change in her personality. A greater interest in shops and clothes has appeared. She liked cosmetics more. A young man she had met 18 months before has become interested in her since the operation, and she's started going out with him with an understanding regarding an engagement. There is a craving to see him and a feeling of sexual excitement when she does. Although the case study ends, her temper is rather worse since the operation and she easily becomes depressed. She maintains an interest in her personal appearance. So you get this sense that although Alan's arguing that sexuality need not be tied to sort of glandular problems, those who have had some sort of glandular issue might well experience homosexuality that can be corrected through the operation, and then it will become, in the case of a woman interested in clothes and shopping and so on, albeit possibly very depressed. So the patients who presented with intersex conditions could receive surgery and had some agency as to what treatment they received and how their sex was assigned. And again, it's not something I'm really talking about today, but when you look at the clinical and surgical case studies, there is a sense that people did have some say in the sex that they were classified. There were people who said, actually, I've been raised as a girl and I'm a man, and that's respected, whereas other people with the same condition would say, no, I'm quite happy being a woman, and that again is respected. There's a sense that with particular, if you're presenting with physical sex traits, then there is some degree of agency, and that's not present for those who don't have any sort of physical manifestation. So the category of people that most interests me in these case studies in relation to the idea of sexuality is a category homosexuals without glandular diseases. And where clinical investigation found no physical anomaly, Alan never recognised anyone as other than the sex they were assigned at birth. And there's a number of people who had arrived at Charing Cross seeking help because they wished to be changed into a man, in their words, or preferred to be a girl. So you see here, I've just sort of brought up some of the case studies and then picked out some of the key points. So here, EB, case 73, 25 years, and again, these all come under homosexuals without glandular diseases. So this young woman presented herself because she wanted to be changed into a man. She wanted to be converted into a male in order that she might marry the girl she loved. From the point of view of her personality, she was a complete male. She was advised to have psychotherapy, but stated that although she was grateful for the attempts that had been made to help her, she had no intention of having it. She preferred to stay as she was, unless she could be changed physically into a man. And so you get these case studies that seem to follow a very kind of classic trans narrative. Here is someone who is adamant that they are a man, that he is a man, and is advised, your personality is male, and, this is somebody who's wanting to marry the girl who, in Alan's language, always there is the pronoun that corresponds with the assigned sex, if it is somebody who doesn't have an intersex condition. And the response is psychotherapy. There's no surgical, there's no hormonal response that can be done here. You will have psychotherapy or nothing. And the response is then, well, nothing. Not dissimilarly, WL, case 100, who's 23 years. She often wore trousers as a child and gave her mother the impression that from her earliest childhood she was masculine in type. She said that at the age of 16 her voice broke. Her mother confirmed this, but said that the breaking was not the same as in the case of a boy. There was no alternative squeakiness and depth. Doubtless, it was a hysterical phenomenon. After this, she wore male attire and insisted that she'd not menstruated since. This certainly was not true. When she wore female attire after this, people thought she was masquerading. Once when she wore skirts, she was told by a policeman to assume trousers. When she was seen, she was involved in a serious affair with a woman who was aware of her questionable condition. She was anxious to marry, and before this to be converted into a complete male not a woman. Her fiancé said that she had known the patient for 8 months and regarded her as a complete male, had seen her body and regarded the breasts as overdeveloped male breasts and the vulva as undeveloped male organs. She noticed the periods, which lasted 1 or 2 days, as a thin bloody discharge. She did not think this abnormal, although she was a nurse. There was no doubt at all that the patient was homosexual. And so you have this description with this ongoing commentary by Clifford Allen, dismissing everything that the patient is saying, with this conclusion that there is no doubt at all that the patient was homosexual. So we're seeing somebody presenting themselves as male and going through a whole series of examples of how this is the case and living a life kind of that where they're being told by the police that they're masquerading as a woman, and yet the conclusions by Clifford Allen as a psychologist is there's no doubt at all that the patient was homosexual. Case RS, someone 45 years old. This was the case of a man aged 45 who came from a normal family. He realised at the age of 6 that he would prefer to be a girl. He never had any homosexual relations at school, and the case study goes on to say how he married a woman. He had no hobbies and his only pleasures were reading and writing, but he'd never written anything to publish. In reading novels, he identified with the woman in them. In his clothes, he prefers to wear a skirt if he is free to do so. He lives in the country. Famous skirt-wearing country life. And wears female underwear. His fantasies were of being a woman. The passive, drifting personality, the interest in skirts and feminine underwear, show him as a typical passive homosexual. And again, you have this drive to recognise someone as being homosexual, despite marriage to a woman, identification as a woman, not having had any homosexual relations. Sexuality, homosexuality has to be kind of a diagnosis. So you see the kind of scorn and disbelief in Allen's judgments. And for Clifford Allen, homosexuality was the diagnosis for those who express sex or gender variance, and it's not seen to be embodied. So Allen was unhesitant in designating people homosexual, and indeed followed a sort of Freudian-inspired line of thought that saw autosexuality and homosexuality as natural stages in a person's progression to, ideally, heterosexuality. The acceptability of homosexual tendencies was partly dependent on the life stage at which they occurred. So youthful homosexual desires features in these case studies as unremarkable. So JK, case 3, 16 years old. It was difficult to determine this girl's sexuality because there is often some evidence of homosexuality in normal girls at the age of puberty. EP, case 27, 34 years. This woman came from a normal family, had a very normal childhood, and was attracted to boys. There was little of the usual homosexuality which occurs in schoolgirls, and she had no memories of falling in love with schoolmistresses or other girls. There's almost a note of condemnation or disbelief that this woman has not followed a more conventional sexual path. RM, case 76, 30 years. At school, he derived pleasure from being beaten by another boy, i.e. masochism, but showed no real interest in sex until about puberty. RF, case 90, 25 years. While at school, he was interested in sex, but he did not indulge in masturbation until he left school. So Allen's analysis of his case studies suggests that sexual desire is a usual feature of most people's lives, and those who do not express sexual desire are treated as abnormal. One of the diagnostic questions inquires about fantasies, and it says heterosexual, homosexual, or autosexual. If no daydreams occurred normally, the patient could usually be persuaded to compose one. So here we have the psychologist sort of forcing people to come up with these sort of sexual fantasies, because that is something that they would normally be done, and that they could be usually persuaded to compose. So sexuality appeared as this kind of untapped reservoir that could or should be accessed. And in his 1940 book, The Sexual Perversions and Abnormalities, Clifford Allen opined that modern society had done far too much to sublimate sex, a situation that was unnatural and healthy. So he's very keen on this idea of sex and sexuality as being a drive and an instinct that are very natural. How am I doing?
10, 15 minutes.
Okay. So homosexuality and non-procreative sex are discussed frankly and matter-of-factly. And Alan held real contempt for a woman who did not believe that she could have full intercourse with another woman. He positioned himself as an expert in contrast to this naive homosexual woman. He knew that women could achieve real sexual pleasure together. So this is BC, case 50, 33 years old. She had affairs with other girls, and when seen, she was in love with a woman. She wished to show her love by kissing and touching their breasts, and said pathetically, "You can't do anything else." Has never tried to have intercourse with them, but has wanted to do so. Her personality showed definite masculine traits. So Alan portrays homosexuality as a maldevelopment, but one which may well play a part in the lives of those who go on to develop normally, and whose sexual nature is not denied. He's sort of incredulous that this woman doesn't supposedly realise that there's more that she can do. What emerges from Alan's chapter on psychology is that sex variance and sexual variance need not be connected, but in the absence of sex variation, cross-sex or cross-gender behaviour could only be attributed to sexuality, and that the only response to this can be psychotherapy. So there's an absolute unwillingness to respect the wishes of those presenting themselves as being sex other than that assigned. And you see this, I'm going to skip over it, but there's one case that begins, "This man complained that he attracted women the same as a man would." This man complained that he attracted women the same as a man would. And there's this kind of confusion of gendered terms, but it emerges that it's a guy who'd been raised as a girl, also kind of presents themselves as saying, "I'm a man in everything but sex." And so you have someone who is giving a very similar narrative to a lot of the other cases, but is decided to be physically male. And so is referred to with male pronouns, is given all of this. And this case study ends with this guy, Alan says, he swung in midair between heterosexuality and homosexuality. So it's not that the people that having been assigned need to therefore be heterosexual. It's not that there's a kind of emphasis on heterosexuality. It's that there need to be physical conditions for there to be a sex reclassification. And if there isn't, and then homosexuality is likely to be the diagnosis. So, moving very quickly to the press stories. These articles reported on some of the same men, such as Mark Weston and Donald Purcell, who had been treated by Gloucester at Charing Cross. So you see this kind of interaction between the press and the medical case studies. They also prompted many readers to seek medical advice. So in his 1948 guide to Everyday Sex Problems and Everyday Sex Problems by Norman Hare, the sexologist, Chapter 2 of Everyday Sex Problems is change of sex. So, this is right up there as an everyday problem. And Hare complains that quite a number of people who are psychologically abnormal in that they are attracted to their own sex instead of to the opposite sex, read such sensational newspaper articles and apply to surgeons to change their sex for them. From what they've read, they firmly believe that such a change is possible, and it's often difficult to convince them that they are mistaken. And Hare is exasperated that he was having to deal with and disappoint so many people coming to him believing that their sex could be changed. A glance at the headlines that were proliferating on the topic in the press suggests why readers might believe that sex was changeable. If you look at all of these headlines, it implies that sex is something that is now changeable. And this leads to people arriving at, say, Norman Hare's doorstep. It also leads to people not seeking medical advice, but you see, for example, a knife and a syringe can be a new woman. You get to stories like that of John Dingy, who is reported in the press as Joan Coney, is arrested following a marriage that's deemed to have been done on false pretenses because it's between two women. And John Dingy, named Joan Coning at birth, presents himself, I'm going to use male pronouns, presents himself as someone who had changed sex. And this has been treated by historians as an example of sort of ideas of kind of lesbianism and cross-dressing intersecting. And what I want to say quite quickly is that looking at all of these press stories, looking at this idea of the changeability of sex, why not take this at face value? Why not give credence to the idea that here is someone who believes themselves to be a man, is a man, and gets married to someone else, gets married to a woman. And John Dingy presents this story saying, oh, you knew me as a girl, but that's wrong, I'm actually a man. And queer histories have sort of tended to think more in terms of sexuality. What I want to do is to think about, although these ideas of sexuality are playing through, also we have this idea of the significance of sex and the changeability of sex coming through. So finally, and very quickly, we have
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay, excellent. Slightly less quickly. Move on to some of these stories that appeared in the press. And one of the features that of some of these sex change stories is that there's often very positive reporting of a subsequent marriage. And so you have, for example, here, going back to 1930, front page of the Daily Mirror, which is quite significant as well because the Mirror is kind of pioneering the use of photos. So you have this sense of the image and getting this sort of sense of who these people are and that kind of photographic representation backing up the idea of sex change or the man and woman. And you have here Evan Burt, and who had lived 29 years as a woman, in the words of the headline, and his long-standing good friend, Sarah Edwards. And interestingly, you also get in this front page, and in a lot of the coverage, a photo of Evan in female attire with Sarah Edwards, prior to the kind of moment of reclassification. Evan starts to have doubts about his sex. He writes to the Salvation Army for some reason to get advice. And he gets medical reports and then a legal report. If you look at his birth certificate, you can see it's been, the entry on the birth register has been crossed out and corrected to say male, where it had said female, and the name changed, because that's still something that was kind of quite possible in the early 1930s. But you get this real delight in the story that now Evan can marry this woman. And there's kind of emphasis to say that there had been nothing sexual in the relationship beforehand. And there is a sense of kind of imposing a kind of heterosexual happy ending to it that reinforces Bert's masculinity. But equally, I think it's slightly more complicated than that, because you have, for example, the arrangement of the photos. It's not a classic kind of before and after. As you read it across the page, you have the supposed after and then the before, if you want to think about it in those kind of terms. You have this kind of mixture of gender and sex attire. There's a really great interview with Evan Burt where the reporter notes that he still carries a handbag and wears a pinafore from habit. And he says, well, I'm used to it, you know, why would I stop? There's this kind of mixture of gendered and sex signifiers. You see him in this kind of typically gendered position of holding a baby. Similarly, Mark Weston, when he comes to prominence in 36, Alberta Bray, the long-standing female friend whom he can now marry. And both of these, the coverage, the newspapers cover Evan Burt's wedding, they cover Mark Weston's wedding, and it's really positive. Evan Burt, in this tiny Wiltshire village, it reports about the local factory girls all coming out to kind of throw confetti over them, and it's hard to tell if there's a degree of kind of tongue-in-cheek coverage, but on the face of it, it seems to be quite positive. And then you get to the point of 1938, Donald Purcell, where the papers, partly because the idea of kind of sex reclassification is not necessarily a story in itself, they create a story around the idea of what the News of the World here terms drama of girls' surprise meeting in hospital ward. They're trying to find a sort of potential wife before Donald has even sort of undergone the surgery that's meant to kind of reinforce him as a man. So you get these sort of strange notes, such as Charlotte Bannister, the girl who is having the surprise meeting. Surprise meeting is slightly stretching it. She's a very long-standing female friend of Donald's, who has come to the hospital to visit him. And so she recounts, Charlotte Bannister, the friend, I was friendly first of all with Doris's sister. Doris is the name that Donald had before. With Doris's sister, Joan. It was through Joan that I met Doris. After a while I found myself attracted to Doris, and it was not long before I gave up Joan to become Doris's friend. Doris was a great pal to me. I noticed that she was a bit boyish, but for some time I never suspected that she was anything but a normal girl. And so, although you have, and has been argued, this kind of heterosexual gloss on these stories, whereby the papers are so keen to provide a wife, to kind of reinforce the maleness and the masculinity and heterosexuality of these guys, the actual narrative is far more blurred. It suggests kind of relationships that are have been ongoing for some time and kind of confound a lot of these clear ideas between kind of male, female, heterosexual, homosexual. So a heterosexual outcome was not a prerequisite for sex reclassification, and some press stories reflected this. A Daily Mirror article from 1937 picks up on a recently published book by Richmond Harvey that mentioned a man-woman prisoner who had married another man. And in this book, Prison from Within, Harvey gave a frank description of the fraternity of homosexualist prisoners in Woman Scrubs, of which perhaps the most notorious figure of all this obscene collection was a man who lived in the hospital and worked in a tailor's shop. There was nothing amiss with his general health, but it was deemed advisable to keep him under constant supervision on account of the sexual abnormality with which he was afflicted. Up to the age of 20 years, he passed as a woman, but some extraordinary change took place in his physical organism, which thereafter brought him into the male category. In the meantime, he had married a man, continued to live with him as his wife, and as a consequence was thrown into prison. So there's not a sense that changing sex, that this idea of kind of sexual variation in the press needs to be linked to heterosexuality, and this kind of frank admission of the presence of homosexuality. So heterosexuality might be a socially desired outcome for those whose sex had been brought into question, but homosexuality was an acknowledged possibility. The press portrayed as pitiful those who had changed sex and then found themselves attracted to one of the same sex, and we see this in a few stories. But heterosexuality did not determine whether someone were held to be male or female. Sexual desire was posited as a natural drive whose object was varied. Heterosexuality was the ideal, but there was a frank openness that homosexuality was a reality for a considerable number of people. Within the dualistic view of body and mind, the body could influence the mind, but the mind could not shape the body. Those with supposedly cross-sex features, such as facial hair on a woman, might be homosexual, but this could be amended with medical treatment. Those who identified with a sex other than that assigned were told that their minds were at fault and that their bodies would never be treated. Sexuality is not an explanatory framework for the treatment of those whose sex came into question. Sexuality has to be understood in relation to sex and gender, and what was being codified in response to developments in the medical sciences.